Of course, 5:20 Tuesday, synonymous on this show with our friend Albert Breer. And I want to play something from back in about halfway through November. This was Albert on the MMQB podcast. Now, we had him on the previous week after Shedeur finally got into the game. Albert kind of gave us a hard time.
It was after the Ravens game.
Yeah, it was after the Ravens game. And here was Albert on his podcast.
I went from the annoyance stage to the amusement stage.
I think
I'm kind of enjoying it now. You know what I mean? Like all these people, like I was on Cleveland radio earlier this week, and I've done radio with these guys forever, and they're awesome. And, but like it almost became a sport for me, like the 20 minutes I was on with my guy Nick, and like where I was like shooting down everything he said. You know what I mean? I was like, and it was the easiest thing in the world. It was just like, what other fifth-round pick have you ever talked about like this?
Ever?
No. Like, do you know who the Browns' fifth-round pick was 3 years ago? Can you remember? Like, how would that guy normally be developed?
Richard LeCount, he sucked. Now, Albert Breer joins us on the fan hotline. Albert, welcome back to the show, friend. Let's talk about a fifth-round pick, huh?
Hey, guys, what's up? Yeah, no, I own everything I say. You guys know that. I'm notorious for some people on this show, I guess, now. My clips have been doing great online, it looks like, though, right?
I mean, you got...
Oh, definitely.
Many people like what you've had to say, and some didn't like what you had to say. So I'm just curious.
Yeah.
It is one game. What'd you think about Shedeur on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's, like, consistently getting better. Like, that's the best thing you can say. And, like, I think you see instincts. I think you see, a talent level. Now, again, this isn't like a Josh Allen or anything like that we're talking about, but I do think, like, he looks to me more talented than Dylan Gabriel, so that's showing up. And I do think, like, there's a feel out there that's, maybe, like, I don't know, like, I've gone back and forth on this a bunch because, you go back and you think about, like, okay, like, what do you miss in practice, and what could the coaches and the front office people, what could they have missed in practice? And, I think back to, Jimmy Garoppolo. Right, and this was 11 years ago now. And Jimmy Garoppolo looked objectively awful in training camp. I actually had a laugh with him about this, back a few weeks ago or a couple months ago. And it was like they took this guy in the second round, and then they put him in a preseason game, and no one expected anything. I was like, oh, well, that looked pretty good. And then they put him in another preseason game. It's like, that looks better. And it was just after the next, to the point where he got like the nickname in New England, Game Time for Buffalo, because it didn't look right in the practice and it didn't look right in camp. And then when the lights came on, he had a way of kind of rising to the occasion. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that with Shedeur, where, look, like you put a lot of rookies in these situations, and, like, that straight line that you want them to be on starts to shake. And I don't get that sense at all with Shedeur. And I'm sure part of that is, like, being who he is and having the father he's had and having played under a great deal of pressure his entire life, being Deion's son. So you do get that sense that he's got a good feel for the game. And, I think it's gotten better week over week. So, this is what we said at the start when he got in there was like he keeps earning his opportunities, and now he's done enough to be the starter the rest of the year. So you get a more full evaluation on him, and we'll see what they think at the end of the season. It's still hard for me to imagine like some sort of scenario where he's the quarterback for 26, but certainly he's created more opportunity for himself at the very least.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about like the Garoppolo comp is that it's like we were there in training camp and we watched him be much better than Dylan was then. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be different if, like, we left these training camps being like, oh, my gosh, he looks nowhere close to as good as Dylan Gabriel. Like, everyone that was there, and then Nick and I were both there for a lot of days where, like, he looked much better than Dylan this day. But, like, they kept going back to the idea that it was all things we couldn't quantify and things we couldn't see. And it was all these other things like he was behind as far as being able to, diagnose plays, et cetera.
Operation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think, like, that part of it is really, I mean, look, like, we've talked about this a lot, right? That part of it's really important. And I know fans don't want to pay attention to that. Some reporters ignore it. But the reality of that is like, if your quarterback has catching up to do on the operational part of it, then that's going to limit what you can do with the other 10 guys in the huddle. And, like, I think that piece of it can be an underrated thing where, like, look, like, as a coach, like, you can be okay with scaling back to accommodate who the quarterback is. That's a hard thing to do, though, because of what it might mean for the other 10 guys in the huddle. You know, like, so there are things like that, like where, and look, like, I was there for one day in the summer. You know what I mean? Like, so my information is based on, like, who I'm talking to and everything else, and that's the way it is for me with 32 teams. And look, like what I told you guys, if you go back, like I think I told you guys before the draft, there's a chance he slipped out of the first round. That was based on what people thought around the league of him. And I told you guys in the spring and the summer that he was behind, and that I thought like he would wind up behind Dillon Gabriel on the depth chart when the season began, which that happened too. But credit to him, like he's worked his tail off and he's caught up, and you know he's got himself into a position where, I mean, he can't go out there and run an offense the way that Joe Flacco can. That's impossible to ask a rookie to do that. You know what I mean? But, you know, evidently he can do enough to have the coaches comfortable to put him in there and for it to be good enough to allow for the other 10 guys to perform at a good enough level.
I think what I struggle with, Albert, is that, you know, we heard, and I know now the framing is from a lot of folks, well, he was, you know, Dillon was just more NFL ready. But I look at it and I think, well, if a guy's more NFL ready, but he's ready to be a backup, and, you know, could you have used all of the reps? I mean, you got to, you know, Dillon was getting first-team reps at the start of camp. He was getting first-team reps in practice. He was all the way. Even when Joe Flacco was the starting quarterback, he was getting first-team reps during practice during the week. And then I watched him go out there, and I never saw anything that looked like a starting quarterback, whereas I'm now 3 games into the Shedeur experience, and I've seen it might just be a game, but I've seen that. So how can I not then look at this and then go to Kevin Stefanski or to Andrew Berry or the leadership and go, how can I trust your evaluation of quarterbacks going forward? Because it feels like you've almost wasted half a season with Dillon Gabriel.
It's a fair question to ask. I think a couple points, all right? Like, I think the first thing is the idea of first-team reps. Dillon really wasn't getting very many in the summer either. I mean, for the most part, it was like, let's get Joe Flacco ready to go. You know, those guys were getting mixed in with different groups in the spring. And so their evaluation and how they split the reps up in the summer was based on the competition for the spring, you know, from the spring. And that really was without, I mean, I said to you guys then, Joe Flacco got a first-round bye, right? Flacco didn't get as many reps with the starters back in the spring because they wanted to get a look at the other 3 guys. Those 3 guys, you know, were ranked based off of merit going into training camp, and then in training camp they got the reps that were there. But even, like, based on that, like, it wasn't very many reps at all that were going to anybody else but Joe Flacco for the breadth of training camp. And, you know, like, when Kenny Pickett got hurt, Dillon Gabriel ate up some of those based on what they had done in the spring. So I just don't know what other way there is to do it. You know, like, if the coaches see it, the players see it, and, like, one kid's ahead of the other just as far as picking up the offense and being able to operate and have everybody do their job in a practice setting at the best level you possibly can in the summer to get them ready to play in the season. And then you just throw another kid out there because it's like, oh, I think he has something. That's a good way for the veterans to look at you sideways. You know, so that's first piece of it is, like, just, I think, like, the idea of first-team reps, there weren't very many to go around. I think Dillon had earned that based on where he was in the spring coming out of college and then going into the summer. You know, and then I think the second piece of it, what I think it is fair is, like, this is what happens when you put 4 people in your quarterback room. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's really where you can criticize them and saying, like, okay, you know, even if you don't think Shedeur was a 3rd-round pick, could you have used that 3rd-round pick on somebody else? Dillon would have been gone. There were teams that were ready to take Dillon high in the 4th round. I can tell you the Dolphins were one of them. You know, and then just takes Shedeur in the 5th round, and then you got 3 guys in the quarterback room instead of 4, and 2 of them are veterans, so you can get Shedeur some of those reps. So, you know, I think there's a couple different ways to look at this. But I don't know. The idea that there was something nefarious going on here is crazy to me.
See, I actually,
everybody wants to win.
Real quick, Albert, the funny thing is, I think the sabotage thing, I don't think a lot of reasonable people were leaning into that. I think there's a difference between sabotage and just not and basically disproportionately. Yes, exactly.
That's what it is. It's a misevaluation. Yeah. But it's a critical misevaluation.
And I think that's fair. And I will say this to you guys: like, I was very critical of Shedeur before the draft in a way other people weren't. I got killed for it, right? Okay, so I told you what the league thought of him, and like I think that got proven out over draft weekend. That's fair, right? Like that, like where I was coming from, I think kind of reflected where the league was on him. Okay. I also would tell you that the league, I think, was a little higher than I even knew on Dillon Gabriel. However, them being higher than I knew on Dillon Gabriel and Dillon Gabriel going over Shedeur Sanders wasn't a result I saw coming based on all of the calls that I made over the course of however many weeks leading up to the draft. And I just tell you, like, the comps that I was getting on those two guys sort of reflect what you're saying. You know, and I think this is where you can be critical of the Browns, right? Like, the comps I was getting on Dillon Gabriel were poor man's Tua, Chase Daniel. It was like that versus with Shedeur, it was more Geno Smith, Teddy Bridgewater, guys who were starters but weren't, like, great starters in the league. You know what I mean? So, like, I just think, like, I think that's where you can say yes. Like, the evaluation, like, even though Shedeur wasn't as good a prospect as most people thought in the eyes of NFL people, and Dillon was a better prospect than people thought in the eyes of NFL people, I would say most NFL people probably still had Shedeur ahead of Dillon. So I think you can criticize the Browns' evaluation there.
Do you feel like Stefanski would prefer a clean slate, a fresh start somewhere else?
That's a tricky question. I think, like, I think he likes the people that he works with. I think this is just my opinion. I think he likes working with the Haslams. I think he's got a good working relationship with them. I think, you know, obviously he and Andrew Berry have a good rapport. I just think so much has happened in the last 6 years. I think it is fair to ask that question, is this the right mix to go forward with, based on, like, the history that everybody has together. You went through the Baker thing together, the decision-making on Baker, which Baker, clearly Baker would have been a better answer at quarterback. You wind up making the trade for Deshaun Watson. Clearly that was a mistake. And you had this core of players that I think was very clearly a playoff caliber core. And because of the mess at quarterback, the chance that core of players had of really competing at the highest level was completely undermined, right? So that's your history right now. So how do you come out of that? But that doesn't mean, like, the people can't work together or there aren't good people. But, like, I think when that's your history, your working history with someone, like, it can be a little bit difficult to come out of that. So I think that's something that everybody's going to have to evaluate at the end of the year.
Albert,
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. No, it certainly, because I think there are some fans who would feel like there's just too much water under the bridge, whether it's with Stefanski or Berry in general. I think what's interesting, and you've been all over this, that Kevin is still very well thought of around the league, and there's this perception that Kevin really hasn't had maybe the final say in these proceedings, whether it's Baker or Deshaun or Shedeur. And what I struggle with is when it comes to it, he's kind of like the Teflon Don. Like, 6 wins in the last 2 years doesn't really stick to him. The Deshaun thing didn't really stick to him. The Baker decision didn't really stick to him, right? Like, none of the negative things that have happened in Cleveland have stuck to him. And yet, if you are part of an organization that goes along with it, on some level, you have to be accountable for the failures of the last 6 years. I think that's what I struggle with.
And I guess in some ways it's like sort of the benefit of working for an organization that has the history the Browns do, which is like people will look at your failures, and if they think you're a good, smart coach or a good, smart GM, they'll chalk it up to, well, everyone fails there. You know what I mean? Like, so, like, I think we've seen that in the past, where, people will be with an organization that has had this sort of track record that the Browns have, and they'll be able to maintain a level of respect. It's a good example of it's Todd Bowles, right? So Todd Bowles, had the 4 years as head coach of the Jets, and a lot of people looked at, what happened in New York. It's like, oh, well, that's just Woody Johnson. That was a mess. And he wound up getting a second shot. A lot of most defensive coaches don't get second shots at being a head coach. But a lot of people looked at the situation Bowles was in with the Jets, he won 10 games that 1 year, and look at what he had to overcome to do it. And, sure enough, Bowles gets a second shot with Tampa. So I would sort of look at Stefanski that way, is that, I do think some people look at it and say, well, he made the playoffs twice. He overcame a lot to do that. You know what I mean? And so whether that's fair or not, I do think it's part of the equation when people are looking at Kevin and his track record. And I do think, look, I'm not the first person to say this to you guys. I don't think he'd be unemployed for very long if the Browns fired him.
All right, Albert, let me ask you which is more plausible after that report over the weekend about Deshaun Watson and potentially not only being on the roster next season, potentially even getting some starting opportunities next year. Shedeur's the starter week 1 in 2026. Deshaun Watson's the starter in week 1 of 2026. Or the Browns draft a quarterback in the top 5 for 2026.
I think they could have a veteran who's not on the roster right now, to be honest with you. I think I've said this to you guys pretty consistently. I still don't think the Browns starter for next year is on the roster right now. Now maybe he is. Maybe it's Watson. Maybe it's Shedeur. Would the Browns entertain a trade for Deshaun Watson and eat some of the money to try to buy a draft pick? We've seen them do creative things like that in the past. You guys can remember the Brock Osweiler trade where money was sort of used as a commodity in that trade, and so. It wouldn't shock me if one of those two or both of them are in the mix next year, but I would be surprised if they're the only two in the mix, if that makes sense. I don't see a scenario where it's Deshaun versus Shedeur for the starting job, and it's just as hard for me to envision a scenario where they just head into the offseason and say, yes, this guy is our starter for next year. Although there is precedent for it, by the way, guys. I've talked a lot about Shedeur's draft status. Washington did do that 1 year with Sam Howell. Sam Howell was a fifth-round pick, if you guys remember, out of North Carolina. So it's not like that hasn't happened before. It would just surprise me at this juncture.
Albert, 44-year-old Phil Rivers, unretiring to play potentially with the Colts there. Will you unretire, cash in some of that eligibility, maybe try and get some NIL to an Ohio State title run?
Oh, what do we mean? What would I do? Unretire from what? Unretire from playing high school football poorly?
I didn't know if you're going to go back to the lantern. I didn't know if maybe a little walk-on action here. If Phil Rivers can do it with pros, I think you can do it with college kids.
I unretired from playing Beirut over the weekend at the Big Ten title game in Indianapolis. Does that count?
That's pretty good.
I think that's a pretty good way to go.
Yeah, and I will say, we crashed an Indiana tailgate, and I hit the last cup, beat their ass in Beirut. And they had some really weird rules too, just so you guys know. I don't know what's going on over there, but it was far from regulation. But we beat them with their rules. And I may have been me and my buddy Seiko might have been significantly older than the group we beat.
It's
Michael Jordan. It was like Michael Jordan and the Wizards,
It's Indiana. They support inbreeding over there. Albert, be great, buddy.
All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Albert Breer there, MMQB on the fan hotline.